All right, so this is part two. We're going to look at major arteries of the body. So Roman numeral 2 of your outline. This part of the exam and this part of the lecture is really just pointing out the blood vessels on the diagrams, and then you need to know, if you know where they are, then you know what they serve, right? So if you know the brachial artery is in the arm and you know your biceps brachii is in your arm, then you know the brachial artery supplies the biceps brachii, things like that. So what I'm going to do is go through each blood vessel with you, and your job is to be able to label a blank diagram with those blood vessels, okay? There is a file on Haiku that I will move to Canvas that has all, it's basically all just blank images like the one you see here. And then you guys, and I have a list to what blood vessels you should be able to label, and then you guys can practice labeling. So we're going to start with the branches off our aorta. So when you look at this picture, you are looking at the aorta. You already know that this is the ascending, the aortic arch, and the descending aorta. We already talked about the right and left coronary arteries, which are branching off the ascending aorta. If you look at the arch of the aorta, 1, 2, and 3, we already talked about that as well. So we talked about how the Brachiocephalic Trunk is this very first branch. This is called the left common carotid, and then we have the left subclavian. And then we have off the thoracic aorta. So let me find that image here. So this is your thoracic aorta. Now I will mention that this is the one image that I do not ask you guys to learn, but in terms of like labeling the blood vessels, but you should be able to choose, you should be able to know by name if they branch off of the thoracic aorta. That should be pretty understandable, because if you see the word mediastinal and you remember that the mediastinum is this cavity in the center of your thoracic cavity, then you know that the blood vessels called mediastinal will have to come from the thoracic aorta, right? It has to be in the thoracic region. If you look at the word intercostal, that means these are the blood vessels that are serving the ribs, right? Costal meaning ribs. Ribs being in the thoracic cavity. All right, so all the terms here in your list, bronchial, esophageal, mediastinal, pericardial, posterior intercostal, and superior phrenic, those are all branching off of your thoracic aorta, the aorta that is in the thoracic cavity. Now I want to point out the superior phrenic because there's also an inferior phrenic. The word phrenic, if you remember the phrenic nerve, serves the diaphragm. And so we have, if you can see the little tiny detail here, there's a branch here and here, 2 branches off the thoracic aorta that are going to serve and bring oxygenated blood to the superior surface of the diaphragm. If you look right after this blood vessel passes through the diaphragm, so there's a hole for this blood vessel in the diaphragm. Now we change names. The blood vessel now changed from the thoracic aorta to the abdominal aorta, because after it passes by the diaphragm, now you're in the abdominal pelvic cavity, right? So that we have to change the name to abdominal aorta. And if you look right after it passes by the diaphragm, you have 2 little branches going to the inferior surface of the diaphragm. Those are your inferior phrenic blood vessels or arteries, and they are branching off the abdominal aorta. So watch for that little switch here, right? I'll point out another area where you have a sort of picky little switch that happens right there. All right, so that's going to be the thoracic aorta. If we turn the page, we're going to look at the abdominal aorta. Okay, so let's look at that. So you will need to know this image. You'll need to know all the blood vessels here. If we look at the very top, we already mentioned these, right? These are your inferior phrenic arteries. There's 2. Then we have 1 celiac trunk. So a trunk, again, is a very short blood vessel, and it will split immediately into 3 other blood vessels, these arteries. one of which is going to go off to the right side of your body. This is going to be called the common hepatic artery. Hepatic is a hepa, right, is a prefix referring to the liver, like hepatitis. So this is going to be the hepatic, the main route leading to your liver. You have to put the word common in there, okay? Don't forget the word common. Then on the left side of your abdominal cavity, right underneath your diaphragm, you're going to have two organs getting blood here from the celiac trunk, which is going to be the left gastric, so your stomach, and then the splenic, your spleen. All right, so what three organs are served by the celiac trunk? You're going to say the liver, the stomach, and the spleen. All right, I have a celiac trunk with the organs in, so this is the celiac trunk. So there's our celiac trunk. Coming off to the right, we have our common hepatic. Going off towards the left, we're going to have one branch going to the stomach. We're going to have the gastric goes up, and then the one called splenic will go to the spleen. So you can see how the spleen is situated. The spleen is situated really on the lateral abdominal wall. The stomach is right there too. Okay, so that is your celiac trunk. Coming back, there are two more sort of single blood vessels. Okay, so the celiac trunk is there's just one of those. There's only one superior mesenteric artery, and there's only one inferior mesenteric artery. So these two will supply your intestines. The word mesenteric refers to mesentery, and we'll talk about the mesentery in the digestive system, but for now just know it's the connective tissue that binds all of your intestines together. And so it's kind of like a sheet between your intestines, and the blood vessels and nerves that travel to your intestines travel inside this sheet, inside the mesentery. So I want to look at this picture here. This is your superior mesenteric artery. It's going to swing off to the right side. Yeah, it's getting my lights left. To the right side. The inferior mesenteric artery swings over to the left side. So what's being provided with blood here by the superior mesenteric artery are your small intestines, and then the right half of your large intestines. So let's look at the term for your large intestines. Here on the right-hand side, your large intestines begin with something called the cecum. So the cecum is the beginning of your large intestine. The large intestine will go up your right side. That's called the ascending colon. And then it's going to go across your body, and that's called the transverse colon. So the superior mesenteric artery will serve about half of that transverse colon. So it's the right portion of your large intestine, along with all of your small intestine. That's your superior mesenteric. So the remainder of your left side of your large intestine is going to be served by the inferior mesenteric artery, which includes the rest of your transverse colon. The colon here is called the descending colon because the waste products will go down your left side of the body. Then there is a curve called the sigmoid colon. And then after the curve starts, you have a straight up and down portion. This is the rectum. So the inferior mesenteric artery serves the last portion of the transverse colon, the descending colon, the sigmoid colon, and the rectum. All right. So those are our superior and inferior mesenteric arteries. Let's go back to our picture. All right, so that's those two branches here. Let's come up here. So we have now, the rest of these are pretty self-explanatory because this blood vessel is going to, you can see it reach towards this structure here. So this organ, if you're not familiar with this is called the adrenal gland, also called the suprarenal gland, okay? Suprarenal, that means above the kidney, because renal refers to kidney. So this is going to be that blood vessel that serves your adrenal gland or your suprarenal gland. So it's going to be called the suprarenal artery. Then you can see this one and this one here, right? They go directly into the kidney. So that's going to be called your renal artery. Then, as we come down, we have our lumbar arteries. So we can see there's several of them. So there's one, it just wraps around the body of your lumbar vertebrae. Okay, so those are called the lumbar arteries. Then we have something called gonadals. So you see how the word gonadal is here. Gonads are organs that create gametes, which are egg and sperm. So this is a pretty generic word because it's not sexed, right? We're not calling these testicular or ovarian at this point because we don't know this person we don't know the sex of this person. But so that's the reason why they're called gonadals. So if this person were a woman, it would be going to her ovaries. If this person were a male, it would be going to his testicles, right? Supplying those gonads with blood. And let's see. Then we have the middle sacral. There's only one of these guys. This one's going to supply the sacrum with blood. And then we have our common iliac. So at the very end, right? So we have the terminal segment of the aorta. This is the end. It's going to split left and right. So we have this region here at the initial split. This is called the common iliac artery. And the word common is important here because when you have the word common, it means that that blood vessel is going to split into either left and right or into internal, external. So in this case, it's internal, external. So we have a common iliac artery. When it splits right here, you can see there's a split or there's a branch coming off of it, right? When it branches, that common iliac becomes different names. This one, the bigger branch, is going to continue down the leg. That's called the external iliac. It's going to be very superficial. And then this one, called the internal iliac artery, will come in and serve the organs of your pelvic cavity. Okay? So same thing on both sides, right? We have the common iliac, internal iliac artery, external iliac artery. Now, here's another little name switch. So I'll mention this again when we look at the leg. Right here, we have our gray structure. You should recognize this as your inguinal ligament. So above the inguinal ligament, we have the external iliac artery. When it crosses that inguinal ligament, it changes name to femoral artery. Okay, so remember your femoral triangle. Remember how we had that, we had four structures there. We had the femoral artery, the nerve, the vein, yeah, and then the lymph nodes. I didn't know if I just repeated myself. But that's going to be your femoral artery in that femoral triangle. And we know that you can palpate these things and access them right underneath the skin. So this is a very superficial blood vessel at this point. All right, so let's look at the next portion of our outline, which is our subclavian branches. And they're going to go down the arm. So let's go back up to this initial picture here. Okay, so we're following these branches, okay? So we have our Brachiocephalic Trunk. Actually, let me just take a moment and just explain what's happening here. So the word brachiocephalic means arm and head. So this trunk, this initial first little blood vessel, will serve both the arm and the head, right? Brachiocephalic. And so you can see there's that split right here. And so right after the split, we're changing name. So the blood vessel that goes on to serve the arm is going to be called now the right subclavian, because it's going to go underneath our clavicle and then it's going to enter into our arm, right? So the subclavian means under the clavicle. And then the other branch is going to go up to serve our head, the cephalic part of it. This is going to be called our common carotid. It's on the right side, so it's the right common carotid. Remember that word common again, it's going to split. So if you follow the common carotid up, you'll see that split. So this is going to be internal external split. There's a better picture of this a little further down, but I'll just mention right now. So one will be called the internal carotid and serve the brain, go inside the skull. The other one, called the external carotid, will serve outside the skull, so the bones and the muscles of your face. All right, so that's how this works. And on the right side, we have this trunk, but on the left side, we don't. Okay, so this initial segment off the trunk, off the arch, is going to be just called the left common carotid. just like your right common carotid, right? There's our left common carotid. The only difference is there's no trunk. So there's our left common carotid. You can see it's going to split. It's going to split to internal and external, left internal and external carotid arteries. And then we have our subclavian on the left side. So this is your left subclavian artery, right? Again, under the clavicle. All right. So let me find the image of our vertebral artery. Here we go. We'll come back to that question in just a second. So this is a nicer detailed version of what I was just talking about. So here's the brachiocephalic trunk. Here's our split, right? It's going to go brachial. So it's going to be our subclavian going under the clavicle. And it's going to be our right common carotid. Then it's going to split into our left, it's going to be our internal carotid artery and our external carotid artery. Remember back to our cranial nerves, and also, the nervous system. We talked about this carotid sinus before. There's a widening of this artery. So the word sinus is kind of used as a wider space, a widening of this artery. And that is where you can detect the concentration of carbon dioxide, oxygen, and pH of your bloodstream. So this is an important area. So this is a separate region. So if I ask you to name this wide area, you want to say carotid sinus, okay? Otherwise, I'll point, if I want you to say internal carotid, I'll point further up. I won't point at the sinus, because if I point at the sinus, I want you to say carotid sinus. Okay, so let's look at the internal carotid goes into the head, into the skull, serving your brain, and the external carotid stays outside the skull, serving your bones, your muscles, and your skin. All right, but back to the outline. Let's find the vertebral branch. So this is off of your subclavian, this little piece right here. What's branching up is your vertebral. So notice this nice artery running right through. What is that, right? So this is the transverse process of your cervical vertebrae. And this, you learn this in bones. This is one of those features that made a cervical vertebra a cervical vertebra, is because it had transverse foramen. Remember that hole in their transverse processes? And it's for this blood vessel. It's for the vertebral blood vessel to travel through those processes into the skull to serve your brain, okay? And it's taking this back road, right, the posterior entrance into the skull. It's going up your vertebral column and entering the skull through the foramen magnum. Whereas the other blood vessel that serves the skull is the internal carotid, and it goes through the skull through, any guesses out there? The carotid canal. So remember that carotid canal of your skull. So there's 4 entranceways into the skull for oxygen for oxygen-rich blood to reach your brain. 2 vertebral arteries, 2 internal carotid arteries. Okay. All right. So and likewise, when we talk about the veins, the vertebral vein will run through the same path. All right. So that was our first. The vertebral branch is that number 1. Number 2, the subclavian artery continues to become the axillary artery at the level of the first rib. So be very careful here. Here's another one of those tricky areas. Notice the clavicle. This above the clavicle is called subclavian, right? Subclavian artery. When it comes back out from underneath the clavicle at the level of the first rib, what's the name now? It's axillary artery. Okay, so be very careful if you're looking at an image like this. This is your subclavian artery. This is your axillary artery. All right, so now let's look down the arm. Okay, so here we are, right? So if I point here, right, this is axillary artery because I'm from underneath the clavicle. Here I am at axillary. The axillary artery will become the brachial artery. So that's going to be in your notes. The brachial artery, and then you might think to yourself, well, what's the transition? What's the point that, when do I stop calling it axial and start calling it brachial? And the answer is actually teres major. But You don't see teres major, right? So let's just say it's the inferior, this is axillary border of your scapula, because that teres muscle is going to go right here. So we can do some, at the border of your scapula here, we can stop calling it axillary. Now all of this is going to be brachial. In the brachial artery, this is where your blood pressure is taken, right? So your blood pressure cuff goes here. And then there's going to be a split at the elbow. So the elbow is going to, that brachial artery is going to split into two major branches. The one that travels down the thumb side on your radius is called the radial artery. The one that travels down the ulna on the ulnar side is going to be, or on the pinky side, right, it's going to be called the ulnar artery. And there's a little detail here you want to be aware of. So if you look at your notes, if you look at radial artery, letter A, radial artery, it's going to supply the elbow joint, the radial side of the arm, the wrist, the thumb, and the deep palmar arch. So watch these two, the radial and the ulnar arteries, come into the palm, and they both do a loop. But the deeper loop is the radial artery. The more superficial loop is from the ulnar artery. Okay? And then those loops will have blood vessels running into the fingers, and those are just simply called digital arteries. Okay? Now, I want you guys to look at here. So remember when we take our when we take our blood pressure, not blood pressure, pulse, I'm coming at pulse. When you take your pulse, if you've been exercising, one place you can take your pulse is at the base of your thumb, at the wrist, right? So you're taking the pulse right here. Well, what blood vessel are you using to take that pulse? It's going to be the radial artery, and the radial artery goes right into the thumb. So the pulse is pretty strong here. So the radial artery and the thumb are pretty strong itself. So that's why they tell you when you take your pulse not to use your thumb, because the thumb is going to have a very strong beat. You want to use your other fingers that are a little bit further away so the blood pressure is not as strong in your other fingers to take your pulse at your radial artery. Okay, now I think I'm going to pause it there so we can look at the brain separately. Let me just see if I need to cover it. Oh yeah, all right, so I'm going to pause it here. All right, but if you wanted to know the answer to this, the terminal portions of the large intestine and rectum receive arterial blood from the superior mesenteric arteries. This is going to be a false statement because the terminal portions, or the end of the large intestine and the rectum, it receives blood from the inferior mesenteric arteries.